As an Indian girl growing up without the distraction of multi-channel cable TV, and also without the freedom to roam the streets playing cricket and generally loafing that boys had, books were my companions. They were my allies. They were my friends. Today I talk to two authors and book lovers about their relationship, their friendship with books. We discuss what we read, when we read, how we read. We discuss the power of stories to open up our worlds, but also we discuss how decisions about who tells stories and whose stories are told can control and limit these worlds. Welcome to The Brown Box, a podcast in which we discuss the good, the bad, and the crazy that make up the country I love, India.
And I think that's the function that books sort of perform for a lot of us, that they speak to us when we don't really have anybody to speak to.
So these are very fascinating tales, and I am totally intrigued and to a big extent angry about the way they have been misinterpreted across years.
As a kid, whenever we visited family, friends, or relatives for a vacation, or even just for dinner, the first thing I looked for was a bookshelf. Small bookshelf, big bookshelf, books stacked on coffee tables, anything. There is something about this visual that just is, I find, stimulating. All those stories just waiting to be explored, worlds waiting to be imagined, knowledge waiting to be learnt. Discovering a bookshelf, finding books, was like finding a great treasure. Because when I was a kid, parents didn't take on the responsibility of entertaining their kids. You had to entertain yourself. You were left to your own devices.
I did have a great family, and but we lived in fairly remote systems. So it wasn't like, you had people to speak to all the time. Otherwise, you were left to your own devices. But in that sense, an isolation makes a great space to read in.
This is Gayatri, talking about her childhood growing up in Nigeria. Gayatri Jayaraman has over 19 years of experience as a journalist and is the author of 3 books, Sit Yourself Down, Humi Poor, and Indigenous. She runs Shama, a mind-body-spirit counseling practice in Mumbai, where she conducts meditation, support groups, and therapy sessions. Listening to Gayatri speak about her childhood in Nigeria stirred some deep memories in me. I also grew up in Africa, in Zambia, and felt the same detached upbringing. And in this isolated world, I found myself drawn to many of the same books as she was.
I think my favorites were The Water Babies, Watership Down, Enid Blyton's, Noddies, but Wind in the Willows. And these are books that sort of grow in that space of leaving kids alone, They're highly imaginative, poetic books, and you need to be left alone. There was this period when we were all sort of fascinated with the faraway tree and, the dormitories at Mallory Towers and stuff like that, is because they represented worlds that we didn't inhabit and we could only imagine.
Books were a ticket out of your world, a world which was very often quite boring. They were a chance to escape the drudgery of a weekend visit to a relative's home, or an escape when you had fought with your sibling and had no one to play with. They were a way to pass those hours of a hot summer afternoon when you were forced to wait until the sun dipped before you dared to venture out. Books were valuable.
We were not very rich people, but the experiences and whatever little we got were presented to me with a lot of richness. So I valued those things immensely.
This is Koral Dasgupta. Koral describes herself as a compulsive storyteller. She has until now published 6 books ranging from academic non-fiction to relationship dramas. She's the founder of Tell Me Your Story, a story laboratory led by crowdsourcing narratives. She consults with educational and corporate bodies on content and communication projects and workshops. Koral shares the story of how her mother introduced her to books and established their importance in life.
When I was very small, she told me that every month she will give me 2 books. And by the end of the year, I would have 24 books. And I still remember it echoes in my ear, the way she said that at the end of the year you will have 24 books. So I think the clue that I got from there was that 24 books is a wow.
The second lesson that her mother shared with her was a less obvious one, but just heart achingly beautiful.
It was a small two-room apartment. From the balcony, I could see the market below. It was in the third floor. I remember the book rack was primarily kept in the living room. Time to time, she would take out the books, clean them. Some of the books that we had some really old books. She would bind them. And then my father's uncle, who stayed quite near and was a professor of literature in Calcutta University, he sometimes came home. And before he came home, my mother would be all panicked about the bookshelf. She would clean the bookshelf, she would take everything down, put everything in order. So all those things, now that you have asked me, those memories are coming back to me. Those were probably things that were very deeply embedded in her. She valued education, she valued one educated person. And when he came, she had her own way of showing respect to the fact that the person is coming home. More than what she served, she made sure that what the person loved was presented in the house in a particular way.
When I think of Coral's mother cleaning the books, it reminds me of how rich people in movies and novels would clean their silver. We take care of what we value. And in her house, it was books. Books were their silver. There's also a certain physicality that I associate with active reading. I remember the weight of my favorite books, and this was always connected to how I read those books. Some were light and easy to carry. Anything from Enid Blyton falls into that category. These could be read in bed or on the swing, or even, as for a time I was in the habit of doing, balanced up in a tree. And then there were the heavier books like The Lord of the Rings, the gold and maroon anthology of Grimm's fairy tales. The weight of these books required you to be seated upright. They needed support, like a dining room table. Their weight also made them feel important, somehow more intellectual.
We read, I remember at one point my favorite pose was lying on the ground with my feet on the bed, like that. And it was like, that's how we read. Like by the time you finished reading, you had started somewhere and you'd ended up somewhere else. Okay.
I also perfected, I'm proud to say, the art of walking and reading at the same time. This meant that the few minutes in between classes when I was in boarding school were not wasted. I could dive right back into a story. I remember once stumbling just as the horse in Black Beauty stumbled, and feeling a deep connection to this black shiny horse, even though I had never even seen a real horse, let alone one as beautiful as Black Beauty. And then there were the books that changed us, the ones that altered the way we saw the world. Sometimes these were children's books, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which you enjoyed as a story. You didn't quite understand or grasp the contents and the deeper meaning of it, but you knew that it meant more than what was on the written page.
Exactly, kind of like the Narnia books, right? The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Like the basic principle of where we connect with a sort of higher self or a spiritual being is pretty much same. And I think books, exactly what you're saying, the books like that sort of allow us to challenge the inherited perceptions of tradition. So we're able to form our own dialogue with our own individual concepts of whatever those higher beings were. One thing that helped me immensely was I had this compendium of world stories, which was stories about children from different parts of the world. And there were many those kind of books that sort of brought you tales from Sweden, from Poland, from about children from Russia, children from Brazil, gave you, along with books like this, C.S. Lewis, gave us the understanding that the world is much larger, but also much similar to what we think it is. And those are the kinds of things that sort of broaden our understanding of the world. And I feel that there's so much focus today on regionality and cultural rooting, which is good, that a lot of kids miss out on understanding that there are people in other parts of the world who are just like them.
And then there were the adult books, the ones that you knew were not for you, but you were going to read anyway. Koral shares this.
My mother had a huge collection of books, and so when my parents were out, I would be reading them voraciously. And many a times I took out the books that nobody told me was not for my age, but there are some unspoken things in the air which makes you know that, okay, this is not for you. Those are for you, that section, that part. So I always violated that. And I grew with the written tales, and also I was very conscious about the stories that were materializing around me. I was very open to uh, everything that was happening to me.
Gayatri remembers it this way.
And my father had these bookshelves that were filled with all kinds of books, from Leon Uris, Exodus, to Enid Blyton's. And the one thing that we never got told we couldn't have was books. At least when I grew up, there was nothing you did not read. And today people are too scared to leave children alone. They want to curate everything. They want to give them hours. They want to give them nooks. They want to give them specific shelves. We had our own books. We had our own shelf, but you wanted to read what dad was reading. You wanted to see that book that was in his hand. What is he reading? What's on his shelf? I've read random things like old copies of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. I had an uncle who had a book called The Lost Years of Krishna, about some random conspiracy theory about how Krishna wandered off into, and was actually Jesus or some such thing, and you read bits and pieces of all of this. You read glimpses of Parade magazine that was lying somewhere in somebody's house, there weren't boundaries, and that fluidity is what I think books at least gave to me. This idea that it was not a textbook, it was not limited, it was free flowing.
For me, the true free-flowing nature of books and stories is epitomized in bookstores. Not the new type of bookstore, but the old type. On Church Street in Bangalore, there's a second-hand bookstore called Blossom. You can go there just for one book and return with dozens. I love walking through the narrow space between the ceiling-high shelves, running my finger across the spines of the books, stopping at names or titles that fascinated me, pulling them out slightly just to peek at the cover, and if it looked interesting, opening the book, crouching on the ground to read a few lines. I love the occasional inscriptions on the front page. Dear so-and-so, happy birthday. Or some secret coded message that I didn't understand but still made me smile. Sometimes you even found letters hidden in the books, used as a bookmark, or maybe a secret hiding place. There were stories within the stories. It's a magical place. But the way that we find our books is changing. Bookstores have changed, and Blossom is an anomaly. It's not the norm.
I do enjoy bookstores, but I also find that these days the bookstores are also organized according to marketing hierarchies. And so you tend to miss out on a great transformative read. Like the, Don Camillo books are probably out of print, and they came as thin volumes that it was almost like a novella that was squeezed between, with some tattered pages in my father's bookshelf.
Don Camillo is a series of books that Gayatri would borrow from her father. A story about a funny little priest who, and I quote from what she shared, intervened between God and the world and shaped her early ideas of God and religion.
I don't think books like that get play anymore, even if people wrote those books, if they would not be in the shop window, they would not have the most elegant covers.
And this happens online as well. Powerful, sophisticated algorithms are saying, read this. This list was curated just for you based on your previous reading choices. And sure, of course, you're probably going to like those books, but will they challenge you? Will they give you a new perspective on the world? Gayatri tells me that she works hard to break away from these marketing ploys.
As a reader, it's only very recently that I've been able to reclaim uh, the joy of the way I read when I was a child. Because I think for a very long time, it was derailed by what I should be reading, even though it's not conscious, even though you're trying not to be prey to all of, the marketing. You do feel a sense of sort of subliminal pressure when everybody's reading Elena Ferrante. What has actually helped me is to shut off from all kinds of news, all the news feed, the bestseller list, and obviously we live in a world where these are all still going to reach you no matter how much you do, but to sort of not actively seek out what I should be reading, and to rather drift with what sounds interesting.
She listens to smaller podcasts and follows people who you would not traditionally follow.
Pick people who you might identify with rather than a reading list. You're more exposed to books that you're more inclined to try. Another person who I like to follow for recommendations is Nigella Lawson. Though because apparently I followed her on Twitter, and she used to be a books reviewer for I think the Sunday Times, and before she got into cooking. And so she'll occasionally put out this Christmas list or this Easter list, and I find that I actually like the kinds of books that she recommends. She's not just following a trend, because she's just reading for her pleasure.
What we choose to read is important, but there was something else that I realized was important as well. Let Koral share her experience. She narrates it so much better than I ever could.
If you look at your childhood and mine, we have grown up hearing these stories as children, from village to city, everywhere in India. When we are children, the first stories that usual household goes through is the mythology of that house, the religion of that house. So, and since we have a majority Hinduism here, most of the houses tell their children the stories of Ramayana and Mahabharata. And what do we end up hearing? How strong Bhim was, how effective Arjun was, how fair Rama was. It's all men's stories. So when you actually stop and think that what happened to the women, were they just shows in these, in educating the woman, in building the character of the man, everything. And this is where we are today. When so many years ago, a literature had called 5 women, 5 virgins, laying least importance to their body and utmost importance to the strength of their character and their spirituality by calling them virgins, the untouched. This had never been told to us.
The 5 virgins that Koral is referring to are the subject of her next 3 books. She explains more.
Sati series is a 5-part book series. So 5 books will come out under this series. And they are on the Panchkanya. Panchkanya is a term coined in Indian epics. These are Ahalya, Kunti, Draupadi, Mandodari, and Tara. 5 women who are called Panchkanya. And when you translate Panchkanya, it is called 5 virgins. I wanted to write about these 5. I was very fascinated about the fact that people like Kunti or Draupadi, why would you call them virgins? And I mean, as I moved through my reading, my research, my writing, I am getting exposed to a lot of things that mythology has done or ancient Indian writing has done. And we have messed it up all in between because of patriarchal convenience. But if you actually go back and read them and try to understand them, you know how rich and progressive we have been as a race.
Who tells our stories is always going to dictate which stories are told, and also how these stories are told. This thought brings to mind an African proverb shared by one of my favorite authors, Chinua Achebe. He says, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." Chinua Achebe's novels were required reading in my school in South Africa, and he was probably the first author I read who had a gaze that was not molded by the white man, the Western man. In his most famous novel, Things Fall Apart, which showed the devastating effects of colonialism on a Nigerian village in the late 1800s, he wrote, "The white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. He's put a knife on the things that held us together, and we have fallen apart." He articulated his problem with the books of Joseph Conrad, books like The Heart of Darkness, which defined the idea of Africa to millions of young minds for generations. In an essay, Achebe has written, "I was not on Marlowe's boat steaming up the Congo in Heart of Darkness. Rather, I was one of those unattractive beings jumping up and down on the river bank, making hard faces. I realized how terribly, terribly wrong it was to portray my people, any people, from that attitude, from that point of view. Who tells our stories is as important as the stories that are told. We live in a country with obvious power structures, the caste system, the legacy of colonialism, our patriarchal structures, different education levels, income levels, class divisions, status divisions, gender biases. And in this world, it becomes so much more important to ask ourselves, who is telling whose story, to whom, and why? Authors like Koral Dasgupta, who are taking that discontented feeling she had when she was a child, listening to the stories of Hindu mythology and saying, "Hang on a minute, this doesn't make sense. I wonder why those women were called virgins." Authors like Koral are important and should be supported, as are authors like Gayatri, who through experience and seeing the world with unbiased eyes is able to tell stories that have not been told before. Gayatri's book, What Me Poor, is about young people experiencing urban poverty in the hope of making it big. Listen to an excerpt from her TED Talk.
And I realized that if you look around, you'll find that in all the teams that we are part of, whether at college, whether at work, you'll find that there is that one person who, when you go out for a meal, says, "Hey, I ate a vada pav, I don't want to eat." Or you're out for drinks, and there's that one person who says, "You know what, I'm just going to sip water, I'm on a diet, I took medicines, I'm not feeling well, I don't think I can drink tonight," okay? Or there'll be somebody who just ordered vegetarian, and when the bill comes and their face really falls because there are 10 of you splitting a bill, and you know that the bill goes up if you've ordered non-vegetarian items, or there's some people who drank alcohol, and everybody else is perfectly fine because they ate and drank and shared everything, but this one person who ordered the cheapest thing on the menu is suddenly having to pay for a whole lot more. So if you look around in all the circumstances, social circuits in which we exist, especially at work and at college, we find that a lot of what we do in terms of expense sort of spills over onto somebody else who probably was not prepared for that expense.
I heard this and my thought was, that was me. I was that person. But no one ever saw that, let alone wrote a book about it. She was telling my story. Moments like these are not as rare as they were before, that realization that someone is telling your stories. Who tells stories? Whose stories are told? Why they are told? These questions are being asked. The world of stories is becoming broader and more inclusive, but we still need to remain alert. We still need to keep asking ourselves, who is telling whose story, to whom, and why? Let's end on a positive note. I love what Koral says when I ask her, if the time of books is gone, will kids only look at devices and forget to read?
Books were loved before, books were loved today, books will be loved tomorrow. It will always remain like that. And storytelling, it is a part of who we are. We keep telling stories. There are so many that we tell each other. I mean, it's not been half an hour that I have seen how you look. And there are so many stories we have discussed. It's a part of who we are. It will always remain in whatever way, whether they are published or they are not published, or they are oral, they are written. It will always be there because a lot of it comes from memories. And as much mechanical as we become, I don't think there would be a time anytime soon, thankfully, when memories as a app inside our brain will stop functioning.
I end my interview with Koral by asking her what is making her passionate at this moment. Here's what she said.
The ancient Indian literature, which talks about women, right? And I am totally intrigued and to a big extent angry about the way they have been misinterpreted across years, and we have been fed completely wrong uh, ideologies and practices. So a lot of women's perspective comes out from these stories. Women's perspectives, the kind of life women had, the kind of people they were, the kind of decisions that they have taken, and most importantly, women's leadership that may or may not have been about wearing a crown.
And this is what Gayatri had to say.
Personally, I have one more book coming out this year, which is Spring Anew, which is a Mind, Body, Spirit Guide to Change. It is a guide, so I hope it will help people.
And then Gayatri shared this wonderful and deeply insightful thought and hope for the future.
I think that for most people, what I would wish is going back to a place where you allow books to come to you when you need them. Because when you function from that place and you go to the books that you are instinctively drawn to, you will find a lot of guidance and insight coming to you at a time when you really need it. And I think if we stop allowing our radars to be guided by just what's the loudest voice in the room, we will go back to an almost primordial relationship with words again. Because the original writers, authors, poets, bards were seers. And they were people that provided a guiding light at a time when we couldn't think for ourselves, or couldn't see straight, or couldn't see the light in our confusion. And I think we have to restore writing to that position, because words are very, very powerful. And I think in the too muchness of marketing, that is lost.
I've loved chatting with Gayatri and Koral. These women have reignited my love for books and for reading. Do check out the link in the show notes to learn more about them and their work. This episode of the podcast is brought to you in collaboration with eShe. eShe is an independent women's magazine and blog based in New Delhi that amplifies women's voices and stories about our shared humanity. You can find more details in the show notes. What is your relationship with books? What did you read when you were a kid? What are you reading now? Do write and share. Links are in the show notes. And if you can, join us next week right here on The Brown Box when we discuss the serious issue of gender violence.